let me talk a little bit about how unions, whether they raise wages or not. Unions do raise wages sometime temporarily for some workers, and then what they do is they unemploy companies. It's sort of like a parasite. Parasite gets fed, but it eats up the host, and that's why you have the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is a product of unionization. But they don't raise wages permanently because wages come from marginal revenue product or productivity. So if you want to know what the effect of unionism is on wages, you have to ask, what is the effect of unionism on productivity? And then you'll know what the effect on wages is. And to ask what the effect of unionism on productivity is very clear. It reduces it. They have strikes, they have strife, they have internecine debates and all sorts of stuff like that.
Nice touch. So I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. The voice that you just heard was Walter Block, libertarian economics professor. And I was thinking about this the other day. I think is one of maybe there are more, but he's one of the only two people I can think of I've actually debated 3 times. The other one is Stephen Bennell, better known by his nom de internet destiny. And I have to say, Block's substantive views are much worse, but debating him is much less annoying because he's way better at sticking, at sticking to the thread of an argument and talking when it's his turn to talk, and and not just sort of going wildly off topic all the time. Although he does do some pretty interesting topic switches at a few points you're going to see this evening. To be clear, the debate was pre-recorded a few days ago. It's moderated by Jonathan Church from Merion West, and they're going to simultaneously release it on the Merion West podcast. But before, we have various things to do before we show you the debate. Although that's definitely going to take up the majority of the episode tonight. It's about an hour and a half-ish long. But before that, any thoughts on the Walter Block clip that we just watched?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Andy, I don't know. I think you might have been looking away for a second, but I hope that you could identify that horror B movie that I put in for like 2 seconds.
Unfortunately, I'm staring at Photoshop right now, getting the last graphic made.
Yeah. That would have been. It was some movie called Parasite. I didn't know it existed before I Googled whether.
There's only one movie called Parasite that I'm familiar with. It's definitely not from that one.
Yeah. No, I had to.
There's a few movies named Parasite, but
there's
one famous one.
Yeah. This was a 1982.
Yeah, that's the only one I've seen. So
oh, really?
That one was about a bunch of Korean people of various economic statuses. None of them looked like that.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think I was based on I object obviously as a former union organizer to the depiction of unions as parasites for various reasons. But on the productivity question itself, that's what got me most interested. It's the type of thing I've definitely looked into it in the past, but I kind of was, trying to look into it with in an objective sense, because productivity that's not even my main reason for supporting or not supporting unions. But yeah, I think it would be great to have an actual economist weigh in on this. But I think based on what we were talking and what we've all looked into it seems like there's no clear data showing that union density affects the productivity of the firm one way or the other. It seems pretty specific and dependent on the context. We've seen places where it's increased, some places where there's been small decreases. It's pretty dependent on the industry itself, but it's frustrating maybe for someone to just say shit like, oh, clearly we see that it decreases density. I don't know where he's citing his data. Maybe if I finish the rest of that long talk, I would see it, but it's he's clearly because of strikes and strife internecine debates that reduces productivity, a priori, right? But the data often shows that the opposite has been the case a lot of times. I think obviously union density is related to what share of the pie of the productivity that workers get, which is more, and that is obviously, that has been proven true time and time again, right, based on the data. But in terms of actual firm productivity, I really don't think the data is there to say that there's a clear relationship one way or the other, and definitely not that, it's always like having this obvious reduction in productivity. So it seems rather dishonest or very, very biased to say that's, I mean, among the other economic claims he's making, that's the only thing that decides wages, blah blah blah, not labor power, blah 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 blah. Again, not an economist, but that was my take at the very least.
Yeah, so this, like, the sort of, to pull back the curtain a little bit, things are so ridiculously nerdy at this show that we actually did spend a little bit of time in the GTA Slack going over some meta-analyses about the effects of union density on productivity in, what was it, the UK, the US, and Japan? I think
Japan, and I was like, where is the metadata of the metadata? I was, looking for that too. So, within 20 minutes, you can't,
basically
text someone. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it reminds me a lot of the debates about the effects of minimum wage increases, which is to say that there are these decades of studies about it, and people love to cherry pick their favorites, right, and to sort of put them up. But if you just kind of put all the numbers in a blender, you just do the like total like average results, from all of the studies, right? So that's, in your meta-analysis, then it actually looks like union density increases productivity, which is interesting to think about, why that might be. And, there are ways of, depending on how you weight it, there are ways of showing like some decrease, but also even when you're doing the weighting, some increase. So it's not clear, right? And this is a much bigger problem with Walter Block, that he has this very a priori view about economics, right? We can just kind of with like a sharp pencil and a piece of paper, right? We can just figure out all the truths about economics without having to go check. And so he'll make these super duper confident pronouncements that's like, obviously it decreases productivity, right? Obviously raising the minimum wage, raises unemployment, which, I mean, there's a point where that one comes up in the debate. He's like, oh, why don't we just have a minimum wage of $1 million? It's like, yes, I agree. That would not be economically viable. But, there are points in between then and the minimum wage that we have now, right? That still would be. But, so he has these predictions based on his a priori model that he's just super duper confident of. And it's like, well, ultimately we're talking about an economy. We're talking about a complex interaction of a bunch of human beings. You can actually check to see what happens, right? We don't just have to reason about what we think would happen. So yeah, I mean, as much as like the thing that bothers me the most about all that isn't even that claim, right? Like that's I mean, to some extent a sideshow. I mean, if it did turn out that giving workers more rights on the job like decreased total firm productivity to some extent, I'd be like, yeah, sure, right? I mean, that doesn't sound like crazy to me, that like if you can just force people to work all the time, and you don't have to give them and you don't have to give them breaks, and you can make them work 12 hours a day, I'm sure they're more productive.
Yeah,
right?
I didn't feel super biased going into that search. I was like, yeah, maybe let me just check, but that's, you got to check, if you say something like that, right? I mean,
exactly.
That doesn't topple the argument for unionization at all. But given but it does
I mean, if there was some decrease, I mean, it could totally be worth it, right? And like the parasite thing is absolutely insane. I mean, that's what I care about the most and all that, right? Is say like, because it's like on this analogy, right? What you're calling, being a parasite that's feeding itself is workers getting together to get a greater share of what they're producing. That they get to keep more of the revenues that they're producing, for the boss, right? And when he says like creates a rust belt, it's like, yeah, sure, everything about the difference between first world conditions and developing world conditions gives capitalists an incentive, right? To like, yeah, just go on this endless race to the bottom, right? Always searching for places where they can pay people less. They have fewer regulations they need to follow. You even see that playing out within the developing world, right? So it's like it's a pretty dismal conclusion if it's like, okay, well, therefore we should just try to beat them to the bottom, right? Like just say like, no, you can have us as cheaply as you want to, right? Like instead of let's not try to do any capital controls to stop capital flight. Let's not maybe try to improve conditions in those other places, to even it out, right? Let's just say that like let's because it would be bad, create more social misery if companies left. So we should just do whatever they want, right? I mean, that's ultimately the conclusion of that argument.
Yeah, I mean, he's taking all the agency away from the actual businesses and firms, right? Saying that the unions are the ones that basically kick them out of the Rust Belt, which is, again, I think I would have to look at data on the capital flight, right? But I doubt that it was that all of these businesses were suddenly unprofitable and forced to leave. It's just that they realized they can maximize their profits by going overseas is my strong suspicion. And secondly,
well, that's definitely true. I mean, if you watch,
like Roger and Me.
I was just gonna say, if you watch Roger and Me, this comes up a bunch of times in that movie.
Yeah. They were literally like seeing the unionists running, the motor companies into Mexico. That was what the movie was about, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, right. So I mean, like the movie is about General Motors moving from Flint, Michigan, and a point that's made several times is that they were actually they were actually reporting tremendous profits already at the time that they announced the move, right? It was just that they could make more profits by doing this, which of course, yes, all else being equal, they'll try to do, right? The fact that all else being equal, they're going to try to maximize profits, even if they're already making record profits, at the expense of the welfare of workers and consumers is in fact precisely why unionization is so important, right? That that they're going to pursue interests that are to a great extent at variance, with the interests of the workers. But like, if you want to say, oh, it's the unionization made it happen, I mean, in a sense, right? It's like, yes, obviously they prefer a workforce with fewer rights than one with more rights, of course, right? They can pay less to one they have to pay more. But also, I mean, if you look at the timeline there, they the sit-down strikes that basically, created the, UAW is what it became, right, as the sort of national level force, happened in the mid 1930s, right, like 1937, right, as the Flint sit-down strike. And I mean, Roger and Me, by that time, you're talking about what, the late 80s? End of the 80s. So,
89, if I remember correctly, but
yeah, right. That's exactly. And by the way, one last point about this, I think this does somewhat go to the reason, one part of the justification, for doing debates like the one we're going to show you tonight. Because look, I know part of the reason I keep going back to this well and talking to this guy is that I just find him sort of fascinating. He's such an eccentric character. I mean, the fact that he was on the high school track team with Bernie Sanders, there's like so much going on, with this particular character in the GTA extended universe that, that I sort of can't look away, right? So that's definitely that's definitely the idiosyncratic part of the reason that I've done this 3 times over the years. But also, I think that Walter Block, in his strange, uninhibited way, says a lot of things that unfortunately people who have actual power also kind of believe. So, for example, right? I mean, go back to the Jackman article I did last week. The previous debate. I mean, Walter Block like advocating like mass dispossession of Palestinians, right? It sounds so insane and so far below, so far beyond what even the most grotesque apologists for Israel and Netanyahu, would normally say. But then, like, yeah, it seems like so much longer than this, but it's just like a week or so, right? Trump. Trump said pretty much exactly that, right? It was 2 weeks ago, whatever it was, very, very recently, right? So that's the anti-war Trump wants the U.S. to ethnically cleanse Gaza article. And similarly, I don't know if we grabbed, if we didn't, it's my fault, because no, okay, we did grab it. So what I was writing about this week for MSNBC was Trump basically trying to destroy the National Labor Relations Board, that by illegally firing one of its members, which takes it below quorum, which means that they're no longer able to contest the constitutional challenge to the very existence of the NLRB, or at least its basic enforcement powers, right? That was launched by Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, right? So, we still don't know how all this is going to play out in court, of course, right? But it's entirely possible. This is essentially the end of the basic protections of unionization rights we've had since the New Deal, right? I mean, this is definitely stuff done by people who have exactly the view about labor unions that we just saw Walter Block express in his characteristically and refreshingly frank manner.
But Ben, the NLRB was the one last thing shackling workers away from a revolution, and now that it's gone, they're going to say we got to take matters into our own hands.
Surely, yeah. It's funny that you should say that. So on Saturday, right, day before yesterday, Jason Myles, who may be joining us in the post game tonight, depending on how the times work out, he's doing an episode, but it might be over by then. Jason and I spoke at this panel at UC Irvine. It was the Platypus Affiliated Societies West Coast Conference, and I don't know when they're going to put it on YouTube. I was kind of looking at their YouTube page. It looks like they have kind of a lag of several weeks between when they do events and when they go up. So I don't want to say too much about it, but quite a bit of it ended up being about the very thing that you were just making light of, which I expressed very similar thoughts to what
I was being sarcastic in case anybody anybody didn't pick up. I mean, I would love that to be, if that's true.
No, of course.
I'm happy to happy to
I mean,
be wrong.
Yeah, I've been like the people I know in like DSALA, people who've been in the in-person capital class have been doing like been talking about this all the time, how it's like, yeah, we all thought that like accelerationism was dumb as shit, and sadly haven't given that thought. But it's like, man, at this point, we better hope accelerationists were right? Because it's happened, right? So like, let's hope it plays out the way that they thought it would. But yes, I think that idea is unfortunately very badly misguided, probably.
Right. Anyway, though, because I know there's one thing we wanted to cover before the debate, right? Unless we had something else. It was funny because there's something brewing with the Mr. McCarthy, right? Who's a new character in my world. I was like, all right, people are mad. But I actually, while doing the dorky research that you mentioned for the union density and productivity, one of the articles I had counted was I believe by the same McCarthy, right? Not the McCarthy that you immediately think of, right?
Joseph McCarthy has not come back from the dead as like a left-wing academic. This is Michael McCarthy, who I have some strong disagreements with, but much better than Joseph McCarthy. And look, I'm not I don't know everything he does. I think he probably does do actually some very good work on some subjects. I know he has a book that just came out that I haven't read, but Adam Proctor, whose judgment I probably trust more than just about anybody on this stuff, like told me it was a good book, right? So I mean, I'm not, certainly not suggesting the man is wrong about everything, by any means, right? But yeah, he came up briefly on last week's show because I had asked our guest Vivek Chibber, who I obviously am a big fan of. I think he's probably the sort of most the sharpest and most politically useful Marxist sociologist that's maybe left now that Eric Olin Wright passed on several years ago. And Chibber wrote a book that I think is a very valuable book. I was actually kind of pushing it on that panel at Irvine, the other day, called The Class Matrix. And that book, I think, in part led Michael McCarthy and his co-author, Dasan is the last name. I'm just not saying the first name because I don't want to get it wrong, because I might be I don't want to mess that up. But McCarthy and Dasan wrote a paper where they were taking aim at Chibber, that's called The Problem of Class Abstractionism. So, class abstractionism is supposed to be very different than class reductionism, although I have to say the way it's deployed often feels very similar to me.
Stop reducing abstractionism to reductionism, Ben. That's
meta reductionism. It's a very bad thing. Yeah,
I'm just thinking about my time at the museum of like abstract expressionism and reduction techniques onto the palette, and it's not helping me at all with this conversation.
Yeah, right. So class abstractionism is, the idea is that it's bad because Vivek Chibber or in other papers on this, so William Clare Roberts did a follow-up one, and he and McCarthy are definitely fans of each other's work. He also mentions like Adolph Reed, right, as somebody who's supposed to be a class abstractionist. In the Roberts one, he also it's just in passing. I'm not a main target or anything, but he mentions an article that I wrote for Jacobin as an example of class abstractionism. And class abstractionism is the alleged error of inferring from the structural primacy of class. And exactly what structural primacy of class means is a little bit complicated. I would actually argue that none of these papers define it very clearly, but whatever. That's just my little marginal nerd objection. That's not the main point here. Of inferring from the structural primacy of class that class is sort of politically primary for how we think about like left-wing, political organizing. And so there's a point in the Chibber conversation where I asked Vivek, hey, something like, here's a critique that's been made of your work, and it's kind of been making the rounds again. Do you have any thoughts about it? And he basically said he didn't think much of it, right? That which is whatever. I mean, as a host, you ask people things that would be interesting for them to weigh in on, but not every offer is going to get taken, right? Sometimes people are just going to say, yeah, I'm just not very interested in that. And he kind of said, look, I just don't think that this is like very good. And, he didn't think it was very, it was like a good faith engagement with his work. And that's more or less what he said. And then that led over the weekend, Michael McCarthy to post this. I think we have the tweet from McCarthy. Says, after 2 years, Chibber responds to the problem of class abstractionism in a podcast called Give Them an Argument. It is a notable point because it's mostly bitter invective rather than responding to arguments. No comradely exchange to be found there. I would note with regard to the little dig at the title of the podcast that if you read my book, Give Them an Argument, I actually make a point of saying that I don't necessarily think that every argument is a good use of everybody's time, right? Like this is not just like everybody has to like debate every point that anybody has ever made, nonstop. I actually like really go out of my way to make that point. But in any case, on the specifics of this, I did record a video where I, just like a quick like 2-minute video for Twitter where I sort of went into a little bit more depth about this. On your point that what Vivek said wasn't comradely, I would say 2 things. First, I'd point out that at the panel you did for Red May on how not to talk about class, which I actually just happened to have watched, you speculate at one point in the discussion that Chibber's goal was not to promote socialism, but, and this is an exact quote, to sell books, which I have to say strikes me as at least as uncomradely as him expressing a low opinion of your scholarship. But look, maybe that none of that matters as much as the second point, which is that I myself obviously do think that your critique is worth engaging. That's why I asked Chibber about it, to see what he thought. I'm actually in the process of writing a paper with my friend Michael Seckman, where we reply to both your class abstractionism essay and the follow-up by William Clare Roberts. I do have to say, I think you guys are presenting something of a straw man. I would argue that Chibber and Adolph Reed and other alleged abstractionists make pretty straightforward strategic arguments for the primacy of class, rather than just abstracting it from a high-level theoretical analysis. And I don't think you guys have adequately addressed their arguments. My co-author and I are presenting our paper at a conference this weekend in Texas, the Caucus for a Critical Political Science, and with any luck, we'll have a version of it that we can make public very soon, which brings me to the last thing I wanted to say, which is, look, I feel your pain. Over the years, many people have said many unkind things about me on many podcasts. At a certain point, if you have strong opinions that you want to widely disseminate, that does become the price of doing business. But if the reason you're upset about Chibber's answer to my question is not that you're personally offended, but that you want the work itself to get a fair hearing, then hey, I'm a big believer in the right to reply. So you are certainly free to come on my show as soon as the response is out there so we can discuss. The door is open. All right. So I will say he responded to that in a way that was mostly perfectly reasonable. So we don't need to dissect the response, right? He indicated some willingness to have that discussion later. He did also say he didn't remember saying the thing about selling books, which I do. And just for the record, we do have that.
It doesn't quite hit all the criteria that I have in my mind for what genuine socialist politics look like. I mean, that to me just seems like it's a recipe for self-marginalization or maybe selling books. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to me actual socialist politics.
Yeah. So, he did say that. Maybe he regrets it. That's fine. We all say things from time to time that we regret. But I think that rather than sort of comparing how offensive what who said about who is, I think maybe let's just talk about the substance of the issue. I should say, while people are waiting for the promise paper responding to the class abstractionism stuff, if anybody's out there like, hey, we don't, we can't wait that long, right, to read you talk about this vital issue that everybody's on the edge of their seat about whether, Vivek Chibber and Adolph Reed are class abstractionists. I would suggest, I don't know, we might not have the graphic for this, but it's easy to look up. I did write something that was responding to William Clare Roberts, who's in that video on closely related issues. The title of that is Taking the Red Pill, Vivek. Oh, we do have it. William Clay Roberts versus Vivek Chibber on the class matrix. Nice long essay, should tide you over. That was originally at the Substack, but it was reprinted Everyday Analysis, so you can find it either of those places. But enough of intra-left stuff for tonight. Let's go to the opening argument.
Oh, wait, we have the, okay, Ben's song first. Gotta be streaming. Debunk all of it. Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue that. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how I see the broader context of the debate that you're about to watch, both in terms of a few specific things that you're going to see me discuss with Walter, and why I think debates like this are worth doing, as absurd as some of the conversation can get. And tying into that, the biggest point I wanted to make tonight, which is about how I think leftists often respond to libertarians in ways that are unhelpful because we take too much of their framing on board. So the debate you're about to watch is a follow-up to a written debate that played out in the pages of Merion West magazine. It started with an article that I wrote, we should have the graphic, called "The Case for Democratic Socialism." And by the way, we've got links to all of these in the description, but this is one of the things I wrote last year that I was happiest about, because what it really is me thinking through the normative foundations of why I care about socialism in the first place in a way that I really don't get a chance to do in most things that I write for most other places. In the article, I argue that for socialism as a fulfillment of the basic values proclaimed by the revolutions at the end of the 18th century that gave birth to the modern world, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, what Marxists call the bourgeois democratic revolutions. So in the original French, those values would be liberté, égalité, and fraternité, roughly freedom, equality, and social solidarity. I do a pretty deep dive on all three in the essay, and I even recap a little bit of it in the recorded debate, so I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what I say there here, but I'll just say a couple of things about it. Certainly the equality part is easy enough to see in an era where the gap between the super rich and the rest of us has metastasized to a level that would have been genuinely unimaginable when our parents were the ages that we are now. I just wrote an article for Unheard about how absurd I think it is that we call super rich people in Russia oligarchs, but we don't use the same word for the ultra rich in this country, even though the likes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have both vastly more wealth and vastly more political power than their brother oligarchs in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I think I'm actually going to be talking about this tomorrow on This Is Revolution podcast. But in the beginning of that article in Unheard, I quote my good friend Rob Larson's book, Mastering the Universe, where he talks about Russian billionaire Farkhad Akhmedov, who's who is often mentioned in the press as an oligarch. And fair enough. That guy is so rich that he has this super yacht that features a pair of helipads, a small submarine, and a pool that goes across 9 separate decks. According to Rob's book, one of Akhmedov's main concerns is making sure that his ex-wife's lawyers don't get possession from him of his yacht, which he calls his beast. So that's a really, really rich guy, right? That's just extremely rich. But if Akhmedov lived in America instead of Russia, his net worth would not even put him in the 400 richest Americans. Never mind the kind of wealth that you have with Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, both of whom are literally hundreds of times richer than Farkhad Akhmedov. Right now, Musk has literally been empowered by Donald Trump through Doge to do a kind of self-inflicted version of post-Soviet shock therapy, slashing and burning through our already shriveled regulatory and welfare states. I just wrote about that for Jacobin. But even putting aside that extreme example, in general, when you have this absurd level of wealth inequality, the idea that you're going to have meaningful political equality is, it's a bad joke. If a worker from one of Jeff Bezos's warehouses calls her senator, she's going to be lucky to have a long conversation with an intern. I guarantee you that if Bezos calls, he gets to talk to the senator. So that's the equality piece of this. And social solidarity, I think, is also pretty obvious. It's certainly vivid to me since I divide my time between Rosarito and Los Angeles. And in LA, like other major cities, it's often hard to even take your dog on a walk without having to steer past people sleeping in the streets. And look, I'm a well-socialized citizen of a grotesquely inegalitarian society, so that's exactly what I do. It's what we all do. But I'm inclined to think that in a more materially equal and decent future where we didn't all have those ingrained habits, if you were out and about and you saw someone sleeping above a grate or on a park bench, you'd see it as a crisis, as an emergency. Your thought would be, my God, what can I do to help this person? The same way it would be if you saw somebody having a heart attack in the middle of the street. You don't think that every time in the world we live in. You can't think like that every time in the world we live in, when living in the streets is quite this common. You lose your mind. So we end up having a society where we're very deeply alienated from a sense of community with all of our fellow citizens. And the value of solidarity, or what the late great socialist thinker G.A. Cohen called the socialist value of community, can be a little bit harder to pin down than those other values that I mentioned, can feel a little fuzzy, but I generally don't trust anyone who doesn't think this is an important value. One way to parse it, which I should say is a bit different from how Cohen would think about it, but I think it gets to much the same point, is that just having a society, like solidarity means having a society where we design our institutions in such a way that we treat every single person as if they were part of the community of who we actually give a shit about. That we don't just tell them best of luck, but you're on your own. And lest anyone misunderstand this point, I'm not saying that we all need to take fraternity, so literally that, you're every bit as invested in every random stranger on the street as you would be in like your own literal brother or sister having a life crisis and ending up on the streets. Obviously, that's not psychologically possible, and even on some level, even desirable. We're all naturally and inevitably somewhat partial to particular people who are emotionally connected to. That's as it should be. But, we all, as Thomas Nagel put it, have our own lives to live. But the point is that when we come together as a society to construct social and economic and political institutions, what we want to do is create collective institutions that really are impartial, that really aren't indifferent to the fate of anyone in that society. Okay, so like I said, I think equality and solidarity are maybe straightforward enough. What I really want to talk about here is the third one, which is the one libertarians are most eager to claim for themselves, which is, of course, liberté, right? Freedom. In that Case for Democratic Socialism essay in Merion West, I quote a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave in 1861 when he was defending the system of free labor in the North as morally superior to slavery, which is, of course, correct. And in the course of that, he was essentially touching on concerns that people had even then, that even in capitalist free labor, there are still potentially problematic relations of domination and exploitation. So Lincoln says at one point in that speech that there is no such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. That line makes him sound like a socialist, but he wasn't. His political vision was limited to replacing slave labor in the South with capitalist wage labor. Lincoln acknowledged that the capitalist system wouldn't be a system of deep and genuine freedom if workers had to spend their whole lives as workers, but he insisted that this would not happen. Instead, the prudent, penniless beginner in the world would work as a hired laborer for a while, then he could save up a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, work on his own account for another while, and eventually hire another beginner to help him. And as much as I revere Abraham Lincoln, if we're honest about this, the idea that everyone who's sufficiently hardworking and prudent can be upwardly mobile through the class hierarchy was already wishful thinking in 1861. Even then, there were only so many lifeboats out of the working class. In 2024, I hope that it's obvious to everyone that things don't work, they can't work the way that Lincoln hoped they would work for the majority of the population. Just the arithmetic doesn't work out. We'd all starve to death without people picking up crops, people processing food. people driving trucks from processing plants to grocery stores, people stocking shelves at grocery stores, and the rest. Those people can't all become upper middle class professionals in any even over the course of their lives. In any technologically advanced modern economy, most of this labor just is going to be done by groups of people working together. The world of small farmers and independent craftsmen isn't coming back. And while class mobility, certainly hasn't ceased to exist in the 163 years since President Lincoln's speech, again, certainly does exist, it's just not structurally possible for most of us to be capitalists any more than the laws of gravity would allow the majority of cheerleaders forming themselves into a pyramid to be on the top level. Our choices are that most people will work communally but be ruled by capitalists who rule their little economic fiefdoms like little kings and queens, or that we're going to continue to work communally but extend democracy to the half of our waking lives that most adults spend at work through some sort of collective ownership and democratic control of the means of production. And by the way, it's only half because of the results of previous workers' struggles by those people that Walter Block calls parasites. So after that point in the essay, I spent quite a bit of time talking about what the logistics of an economically viable form of collective ownership might look like. But what I want to emphasize right now is that whether people work together but are subject to the whims of an unelected boss, or whether they collectively and democratically run the place and collectively and democratically decide how the products of their collective labor will be divvied up at the end of the process, is, to me, ultimately a question about freedom from domination. That's not the libertarian notion of freedom, which is non-interference, which I argue in the debate is totally vacuous, that it tells us nothing about what the distribution of wealth should be. That's a sort of basic argument that I get from people like G.A. Cohen and Matt Brunig. I won't repeat any of it here. But what I'm talking about is a much, I think, deeper and more important idea of freedom. It's what political theorists call the Republican theory of freedom. And of course, that's Republican with a small r, like Republican, not Republican like the odious political organization in the contemporary United States. And that, to me, is the biggest and most important disagreement that's revealed in debates like this, the disagreement about freedom. And part of the purpose of doing this kind of debate is to convince anyone who might be watching in the audience who's persuadable. I mean, it wouldn't be psychologically realistic for either Walter or I to hope to persuade one another. We're both too dug in way too deep on this sort of fundamental worldview questions. But the goal is always to persuade whatever chunk of the potential audience is persuadable, or at the very least to plant some seeds that might help them be persuaded down the line. And sometimes people say, look, why do you talk to this lunatic who says, well, I'm not going to tell you what he says because, no spoilers, but he says some pretty amazing things in this debate that we're going to watch tonight. So the idea is, oh, well, anybody who takes this guy seriously is just unsalvageable. But I think that this fundamentally misses the point, even the part of the point that's about persuasion. Oftentimes, people who nod along with libertarian rhetoric about freedom might have second thoughts when they see where those libertarian principles actually lead. You might agree with the premise when it's a sort of floating abstraction and it's like specific meaning isn't all that clear. But then when you get to the conclusions that are logically arrived at from that premise, you get off the bus and really reconsider. I see tremendous value in that. Like, look, to name somebody who, I don't always agree with about things that are happening, at the moment in the left or whatever, but who's been on this show before. I think Sam Cedar is a master of this. When he argues with libertarians, like when he did the debate with Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute, and they were talking at the end of it about the Miami condo collapse. And Sam said, you don't see a role for government and safety and preventing things like that? And Yaron said, no, it should be the responsibility of the tenants to do research on the company's safety practices. That's a real, Deuteronomy 30:19 moment. I've set before you on this day life and death. People who might nod along with the rhetoric about freedom might realize that this is a theory of what freedom is that's actually horrifying. So that's that half of the reason to do these debates that's about persuasion. But the other half, and this is something Vivek Chibber and I spoke to, Vivek, I should say, not me, right? Like I just kind of nodded and said, yeah, good point. But Vivek spoke to it in a really eloquent way last week on the show when he was talking about the value of free speech and how part of that value has actually nothing to do with persuading anyone. It's that it keeps us intellectually honest by making us run through our paces and us get clearer and sharper in our own heads about what we think and why by dissecting the arguments that are made against us, even some pretty absurd arguments. That to sort of see exactly what's wrong with that, you have to dig pretty deep, right? You can learn a lot that way about what you think, about values that might be lodged so deep you never actually take them out and expose them to the sunlight and think about them in that more critical and reflective way. And again, I see tremendous value in that. So in that spirit, let's talk about two really specific things that came up in this debate about that are both in some way or another about freedom, and then wrap up with a more general point. So the first has to do with so-called economic freedom rankings that are put out by the libertarian Fraser Institute in Canada. I actually wrote an article about these rankings for Jacobin in 2021, but I guess Walter never read that, because in his reply to me in Merion West, it's called Rejoinder to Ben Burgis, the case for laissez-faire capitalism. Walter makes heavy use of the Fraser Institute numbers to try to show that the more capitalist and the less socialist a country is, the more of all the good things it has, and the less of all the bad things. But the rankings themselves are just brutally absurd. As I say in the debate you're about to watch, but I don't have time there to elaborate, the rankings don't measure a goddamn thing except how creative think tank hacks can be when they need to put a bunch of numbers into a blender over and over again until they get the results that they want. In fact, I would argue the results themselves prove without a shadow of a doubt that these rankings don't measure how socialist or even how social democratic a country is, since the countries in the capitalist world that have the most of the things that socialists and social democrats advocate as far as like short-term reforms go, and the least of the things that libertarians want, places like Sweden and Denmark and Norway, actually show up as very capitalist. And there are places like Haiti that have almost none of those things, that show up as very economically unfree, or the way that people like Walter would put it, and the way that I think even a lot of Fraser's own sort of promotion of these rankings would lead us to think about it, would make them more socialist. Haiti has such a crazy degree of hyper-exploitation that, as recently as Barack Obama's first term, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, WikiLeaks cables came out that showed that Hillary Clinton's State Department was lobbying the Haitian government at the behest of various American companies with subcontractors in Haiti against raising the minimum wage in Haiti to the princely sum of $5 a day. So again, where do the laws provide more protections for organizing a union? Haiti or Sweden? Where is there a bigger welfare state? Haiti or Sweden? Come on. And in fact, if you do a little, actually, I think I mentioned this one in the debate, but when I sort of first realized how that there was something that must have gone completely wrong here, was reading this Peter Leeson paper where he makes heavy use of the Fraser rankings. And in that, right, he says, okay, he actually mentions, and this completely undermines Leeson's case, but he mentions it anyway without seeming to realize it, that he says, okay, only a few countries have become, he wrote this paper in 2005, less capitalist in the last 25 years. And sure, lots of bad things have happened in those places. And the three countries that he mentions, one of them is Ukraine, right? So if you take the Fraser rankings seriously, between 1980 and 2005, Ukraine became less capitalist, right? So taken literally, that would mean the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, a member state of the USSR, was more capitalist than post-privatization, post-shock therapy Ukraine in 2005. I mean, this is just unspeakably silly. And if you start looking behind the curtain at the methodology, which you can find a lot of on Fraser's website, you start to get a sense of how. they're including just wacky shit like sound money. And if you really look at what they mean by that, it's like if there's a lot of inflation, then they count that as like less economically free or less capitalist, and they have a justification that, oh, well, see, like inflation happening, sort of takes away the benefits of economic freedom. So we're going to count places as less free if they have lots of inflation, which again is just totally absurd. It puts the cart before the horse. Like an argument you would expect a libertarian or a conservative to make is, oh, look, all these horrible socialist policies meddling with the market will lead to lots of inflation. That would be a real anti-socialist argument, but they're not making that, right? They're saying, oh, we're just going to count the bad things happening as evidence of less capitalism, and then we're going to conclude, oh, see, less capitalism means more bad things happen. It's a completely unserious way to argue. And in the Jacobin article, I said, like, a lot of the things that they count, like as their general categories for analysis, don't even sound like they have anything to do with economic freedom in any sense that might be in dispute between libertarians and neoliberals on the one hand and social democrats and socialists on the other hand. And even one of the ones that does sort of sound like it would be relevant, that's is it legal regime and property right, or sorry, rule of law and property rights, I think it is. I kind of took the time in the article to break down the criteria. This is the A through H graphic, and if you look at those the criteria there, right? So the things that they count for rule of law and property rights, and that already sounds very suspicious. Oh, wait a second, not just property rights, but rule of law and property rights, right? And so it's A, judicial independence, B, impartial courts, C, protection of property rights, D, military interference in rule of law and politics, E, integrity of the legal system, F, legal enforcement of the contracts, G, regulatory costs of the sale of real property, H, reliability of police. And of course, you don't get a lot of, people with like social democratic politics going out saying, you know what the problem is with America? Police are too reliable and the legal system has too much integrity, and there's too little military interference in rule of law and politics, right? So I guess when Augusto Pinochet overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, then Chile lost economic freedom points, right? So it was counted as less capitalist because of military interference in rule of law and politics, right? Item D. The only thing, right, out of these 8 criteria that even sounds relevant is C, protection of property rights. And I think that's almost certainly completely irrelevant. Because if property rights are being protected against nationalization, then I understand how they're relevant. But in any other sense, they're not relevant, right? And I'd seriously doubt that almost any of these numbers have anything to do with nationalization. Right? So you see similar things, when you look at other criteria. So at the time, Tibor Rutar, who's also been a guest on the show, and I'm actually, very fond of him in many ways as an interlocutor, but I find him very unconvincing on this point. So he did a critique of the Jacobin article on Chris Freeman's Substack that we might or might not have the graphic of, but in any case, it's a Tibor response. So it's called Economic Freedom Indexes do seem to measure how capitalist a country is, a response to Ben Burgis. And I would say, I don't know if Tibor, this was a guest post on somebody else's blog. I don't know if he wrote that title, but if he did, it's a very misleading title, right? Because I think even what he shows in there doesn't bear this out. He does a lot of, if you recombine the numbers to take out certain categories and subcategories, you still get broadly similar results. Although even at that, when he's done messing with it, some of the results don't look that similar. But I think the bigger point, he's just kind of assuming that, okay, some of the Fraser categories are surely fine, right? So if we just take out the specific ones I criticize, then the criticism is irrelevant, which I think misses the point of the criticism. What the criticism shows is that these are really dishonest hacks, right? They're just putting a bunch of different unrelated factors in a blender to get the results that they want. That, oh, see, economic freedom leads to all the good things, and leads away from all the bad things. And so they're more than happy to just stuff the bad things resulting into the blender with everything else, right? So if you look at the way that things are mixed together there, I mean, even if you look at the details of some of what he talks about in the article about regulation, right? There's all sorts of things that are factored into the how much regulation is there, size of government part of the Fraser rankings that have absolutely nothing to do with issues in dispute between social democrats and socialists in one camp, right? People who, in other words, either want sort of socialistic-y kind of reforms to capitalism or want to maybe start there but go further. And on the other hand, neoliberals and libertarians. So a lot of that, in fact, Matt Brunig has done great stuff about this. A lot of that has to do with stuff like how hard it is to start a business, which, if you really look into the details, it's like a lot of that's like how many forms you need to fill out, stuff like that. And so people say, aha, Norway and Sweden, actually have like pretty low regulatory oversights, less in some ways than the United States. It's like, yeah, but a lot of that's because of American federalism, that there are various like state and federal things that you have to go through. Whereas some of these other countries they're being compared to, they're more centralized, which is in fact not something libertarians and conservatives have typically been fans of. That they, those guys typically like federalism, decentralization, which leads you to more forms to fill out with more places. And again, it has absolutely nothing to do with stuff like how wages are set, which in the Nordics has often been by sectoral bargaining, which is so you have big powerful unions that bargain for wages on behalf of entire sectors of the economy, right, including non-members of the unions, and is every bit as intrusive in capitalist property rights in its own way as the minimum wage stuff. So I think the idea, again, if you wanted to show, I think if the Fraser people were serious people, they would say they could argue for specific policies leading to more of the good things and less of the bad things, and just show you clean numbers for that. But all the numbers, even within the broad categories, they're mixing and matching all sorts of subcategories in a way that just make the whole thing meaningless mush, right? I don't see any reason to take any category or subcategory these people give us seriously. The other thing about freedom that I wanted to touch on, because it comes up in the debate, was about something I referred to a minute ago. That was Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who were two of the biggest leading lights of libertarianism in the late 20th century, who both supported, were apologists to one extent or another for the military right-wing dictator Augusto Pinochet after he overthrew the democratically elected Chilean socialist president Salvador Allende and initiated this reign of terror against the Chilean left because he couldn't defeat them electorally. And in the debate, I say this, and then Walter says, well, people say that about Milton Friedman. He totally ignores the Hayek part. People say that about Milton Friedman, but all he did was go down to Chile and give Pinochet economic advice, and he went to China and gave Deng Xiaoping the same economic advice. So why is it that people are using the Chile one to prove something and not the Deng Xiaoping one? It's like, okay, well, first of all, I actually think criticizing libertarians for being too buddy-buddy with the authoritarian leader of China is also definitely legitimate, right? But also I think some relevant differences between the two situations are that Deng Xiaoping hadn't just overthrown a democratically elected government and initiated a bloody reign of terror against supporters of that government, right? China had already been authoritarian long before he came on the scene. And particularly if you look at the letter that Milton Friedman wrote to Pinochet after his visit, warmly thanking him for his hospitality and saying he was happy to see that Chile was on the right track. I think that does go beyond just, he'll just give economic advice to anybody. If Darth Vader asked him for economic advice, he'd give it. Say, thank you so much. You're such a great host. I'm so glad to see the country's on the right track. That sounds to me like actual Pinochet apologism. And that's just Friedman. The case is actually way, way better for Hayek. So if the best thing to look at here, back in 2013, Corey Robin wrote something on his blog called the Hayek-Pinochet Connection. And in there, he goes into the details, and he says, no, this is actually not at all true, right? That all Hayek did was say Pinochet was better than Allende, and how bad is that? It's like, well, first of all, that would actually be very, very bad if Hayek was saying that the bloody military dictatorship who overthrew democracy in Chile and initiated a reign of terror against the Chilean left was better than the democratically elected president who came before him, right? So even if that were true, that'd be bad enough, but it's not true, right? So from the Robin article, Hayek first visited Pinochet's Chile in 1977 when he was 78. Amnesty International had already provided him with ample evidence of Pinochet's crimes, much to his annoyance, but he went anyway. He met with Pinochet and other government officials who he described as educated, reasonable, and insightful men. According to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, Hayek told reporters that he talked to Pinochet about the issue of limited democracy and representative government. He said that in his writings, he showed that unlimited democracy does not work because it creates the forces that in the end destroy democracy. He said that the head of state listened carefully, and he'd asked him to provide him with the documents written on this issue. Hayek complied with the dictator's request. He had his secretary send a draft of what eventually became Chapter 17, a model constitution in the third volume of Hayek's Law, Legislation, and Liberty. The chapter includes a section on emergency powers, which defends dictatorships when the long-run preservation of a free society is threatened. Corey Robin notes, long run is an elastic phrase, and by free society, Hayek didn't mean liberal democracy. He has something more particular and peculiar in mind. Quote, that the coercive powers of government are restricted to the enforcement of universal rules of just conduct and cannot be used for the achievement of particular purposes. That phrase, Robin notes, is doing a lot of the work here. Hayek believed, for example, that the effort to secure a specific distribution of wealth constituted the pursuit of a particular purpose. So the threats to a free society might not simply come from international civil war, nor they be imminent. In other words, it's fine to have, this is me, not Corey Robin. It's fine to have a temporary dictatorship in order to prevent socialists from violating capitalist property rights, because what they really mean when they talk about freedom is capitalist property rights, right? So, but what is that, right? What we talk about capitalist property rights, right? Property rights in the means of production is the freedom of particular sort of miniature economic dictators to run their little miniature kingdoms as they please, right? I mean, this is the freedom of a child who has trapped a bug in a jar to do whatever he wants to with the bug, except for in this analogy, the bug is the working class majority of society. It's an absurd account of freedom. And the reason I'm really emphasizing this point, and this is the last thing I want to say here, is that this notion of what freedom is, right, fundamentally does not track what ordinary people care about when they think about freedom. Right? And I think this goes from everything from the sort of long-term goals about workers' control of the means of production that would, sort of end this domination of the majority of society by a wealthy minority, to very short-term issues like, are you going to stay in a job you hate, right, for fear of losing your health insurance? Or can you take a year off to write that novel, right? these are the kinds of issues that impact how free people are. And I think there's a bad habit by some on the left to sort of cede the freedom framing to the libertarians, if anything, right? To say, oh, those guys care too much about freedom as opposed to these other values, that's where they go wrong, that they have a sort of selfish obsession with their own rights as opposed to the greater good. And I think that's exactly the wrong way to argue with them, right? So I just saw this quote from Naomi Klein, who's somebody who does good work, but I think people know I have some disagreements with her. But somebody quoted this in that panel I was on, that Jason and I were on at UC Irvine the other day, where Klein is talking about economic shock therapy, and she says that the neoliberals who are carried it out, she accuses them of being utopians who are obsessed with this long-term vision of economic freedom, and said, oh, we don't need grandiose visions of freedom or something like that, right? I think this is exactly the wrong way to argue against neoliberalism. We need to argue against this stuff on the basis of a much more expansive view of human freedom, as opposed to the privatized petty tyrannies that are being defended by libertarians. All right.
Right. Is it time for the debate, or any more housekeeping before?
I did do a cartoon while you were talking.
Oh, by all means.
Yeah, it's here. Yeah, right there.
This is the class abstractionism cartoon?
Yes. Yes.
Nice.
Different art movement. Nice.
Yeah. If anybody's listening to this as a podcast later, this comes up at about the 108 mark in the YouTube video. If you want to check out the artwork. Okay. So we're probably not going to watch the entire thing tonight, but we will show you like a good long chunk of the debate at least tonight. And we will release the whole thing as a great big clip very soon. I don't know, maybe if not later this week, then not very late next week at the latest. But meanwhile, let's watch however much of it we're going to get watched tonight.
Hello and welcome to the 22nd episode of the Escaping Ideology podcast series, a nonpartisan production of Merion West, where we try to engage in independent thought, critical commentary, and in-depth interviews from across the political and cultural spectrum. I'm your host, Merion West contributing editor, Jonathan Church. In this episode, I moderate a stimulating and spirited debate between philosophy professor Ben Burgis and economics professor Walter Block on the age-old debate over whether socialism or capitalism offers a better way of life. In this
Seems to be an error with it, so I'm going to share it. I'm going to share it a different way. So just give me 1 second. I don't know why that's happening.
No problem.
We do have a backup, which is good. But this is going to take about 30 seconds. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Any thoughts on the debate so far? Yeah. Well, I think so far Jonathan is winning.
I'd like to see the what's it, the compassion fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah. No, if I would be so honored if he did a musical version of this debate.
Okay. We should be good. Sorry about that. Hopefully, let's see if this works.
No problem. Let's give it a shot.
Hello and welcome to the 22nd episode of the Escaping Ideology podcast series, a nonpartisan production of Merion West, where we try to engage in independent thought, critical commentary, and in-depth interviews from across the political and cultural spectrum. I'm your host, Merion West contributing editor, Jonathan Church. In this episode, I moderate a stimulating and spirited debate between philosophy professor Ben Burgis and economics professor Walter Block on the age-old debate over whether socialism or capitalism offers a better way of life. In this debate, Ben will make the case for democratic socialism, while Walter will make the case for laissez-faire capitalism. Both Ben and Walter have a long history of arguing for their respective positions, and I encourage listeners who may be unfamiliar with their backgrounds to do a basic Google search on them, and that should be sufficient to acquaint listeners with the impressive scope of their public commentary. But with all that in mind, let's launch into the debate. Welcome to this debate between Ben Burgis and Walter Block. This is a debate that is going to touch upon one of the, long-lasting perennial topics of debate in contemporary society, and the topic of economics and philosophy and politics and so on. It's essentially capitalism versus socialism. Ben is going to make the case for democratic socialism. As I understand it, a normative case for socialism as a social system that promotes equality, liberty, and solidarity, but recognizing that there's varied meanings of capitalism, socialism in the current discourse. Will lay out his own case for a particular kind of democratic socialism that he has in mind. Walter will then present a rebuttal to Ben's argument, and at least as I understand it, will argue specifically for laissez-faire capitalism as an alternative to Ben's idea of democratic socialism. So, as I said, socialism or capitalism, as defined by or argued for by our prospective and eminent interlocutors. So before we get started, just a brief layout of the format. Ben will have 10 minutes to present his opening argument. Walter will have 10 minutes to present a rebuttal. You don't have to use the whole 10 minutes, and if you don't, presumably we'll have some more time for back and forth, that back and forth is as described below. So after the opening, I expect that there'll be a great urge to respond to each other's openings. So we will give Ben and Walter 5 minutes apiece to respond to their opponent's opening. And then depending how that goes, maybe an additional back and forth of 2 to 3 minutes per person. So we just want to make sure everybody has equal time and that we don't go down a rabbit hole. And then I'll have a question for each of you, one challenging Ben, one challenging Walter, 5 minutes each to respond, and then maybe 2 to 3 minutes per person, depending on the nature of the objection and so on. We'll play it a little bit by ear. Again, equal time, no rabbit holes. And depending on where we stand in terms of time, I may have a second set of questions, but we're going to try to keep this. I suspect it'll go over an hour, but definitely within, less than say an hour and a half. And so at that point, we will proceed to the closing argument, 5 minutes apiece. Ben goes first, Walter goes second, same as in the opening. And throughout it all, we will have a time clock to keep track of each other's time, I guess for the benefit of everybody, but in particular Ben and Walter, so they can keep track of where they are in their particular arguments. So with that said, I have it set at 10 minutes, and we will start with Ben, the case for democratic socialism.
All right. Thank you, Walter, for doing this debate. And thank you, Jonathan, for stepping in once again to moderate. When I say that I'm a socialist and I'll be arguing for democratic socialism, I mean two things by that. They're both pretty standard things for people to use those phrases to mean. but it's important to get clear on these distinctions so we don't end up talking past each other. When politicians like Walter's high school classmate Bernie Sanders talk about democratic socialism, they usually seem to be talking about implementing socialist policies within a basically capitalist context. So Medicare for All, for example, is a socialist policy. Basically, you're nationalizing the health insurance industry and providing medical care outside of the market to everyone. Lots of societies that have implemented similar programs are still, capitalist societies, certainly, but we all know what someone means when they call that a socialist policy. And I'm certainly a socialist in that sense. To stick with that example, I think implementing something like Medicare for All is morally urgent. And to the extent that we spend our time here talking about that point, I'm extremely happy to do so. Americans will stay in jobs they hate for fear of losing their employer health insurance. Sometimes they'll even stay in marriages they hate for fear of losing their spousal health insurance. These are things that in practice, in concrete reality, make Americans less free to live our lives how we please than citizens of many other advanced countries. And that's not even to get into the higher rates of mortality amenable to healthcare that you get because of our much more marketized healthcare system. The people who don't have health insurance, who have a spot that could be cancer and could be nothing, but don't get it checked out because they don't want to pay out of pocket. The people who do have health insurance and end up, having a serious issue and spending half their lives on their phone, or the loved ones do, to try to get a human on the phone to reverse a cost-cutting decision that was made by the insurance company's AI, the diabetics who will sometimes die because they're trying to ration out their insulin. These are things that don't happen in the Nordic countries, for example. Most of them don't even happen in Canada, where at least basic health insurance is nationalized, even if there's a market for supplemental coverage. So yeah, I'm very enthusiastically in favor of democratic policies, democratic socialist policies, like that example about Medicare for All. As I said in my first essay, these are the kinds of programs that would make our society that much more civilized, and they would accomplish this by contracting the scope of capitalist property rights, whether by, in that example, nationalizing health insurance, or through redistributing resources through progressive taxation, as is the case for any number of other programs. Similarly, various programs that are already in place, ranging from K-12 public schools to public fire departments that have to put out burning hovels no less than burning mansions, make our society that much more humane and livable. And they too do it by contracting the scope of capitalist property rights. But neither public fire departments nor public health care amount to socialism in the second major sense in which that term is used. And I'm also a socialist in that sense, that I think that the long-term goal of left-wing politics should be to move beyond capitalism to a new kind of economic system. Okay, so what kind of economic system would that be? Well, it's certainly true that some Western socialist intellectuals in the 20th century were apologists for authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union that called themselves socialist. Like I said in that first essay, I think that was a grievous moral and political error, much as, for example, the leading lights of libertarianism, like Hayek and Milton Friedman, were making a similar mistake when they engaged in apologetics for former President Augusto Pinochet's reign of terror in Chile after he overthrew the democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende. But there's always been another strand within the socialist tradition that never had any truck with any of that, and that's the one that I would identify with. Socialists, going back to Marx and Engels, objected to capitalism because democracy stopped at the factory gates. They wanted something that was more rather than less democratic than liberal capitalist democracies. And after the Russian Revolution, there were people ranging from, Rosa Luxemburg to Trotsky to Michael Harrington, and I'm casting a very wide net here. These are people who disagree with each other about all sorts of things, but they all agreed that the Soviet model wasn't what they wanted to come after capitalism. They wanted a system where instead of private owners controlling the means of production and running those economic fiefdoms like miniature dictatorships, the means of production were under the control of the workers themselves or the broader community or some combination of the two. And I go into a bit more detail in my essay and link, and I provide a hyperlink for anyone who's interested in a good article about the logistics of how this could work by a left-wing economics professor, Mike Beggs. For anyone who's interested, it's called "We Can Craft a Workable Workplace Democracy for a Socialist Future." But for now, let me just say that look at the real-life successes of social democracy and the real-life successes of worker cooperatives like Mondragon in Spain. There's every reason to be skeptical when libertarians confidently assert that it would be impossible to have a thriving economy if the working class took over the means of production from the wealthy elites that currently dominate society. I'm sure we'll argue about that pragmatic point tonight, but what I want to focus on in the time I have left is the more basic normative disagreement. Because whether or not it's economically safe to experiment with ways of democratizing workplaces and creating a society that's not divided into a class of owners and a class of workers, that's one question. But a more fundamental question is whether, if it is possible, it would be desirable. And on that more fundamental question, Walter and I fundamentally disagree. I explained my position on the normative question in that first essay in terms of three values that are important to me. These aren't some special socialist values that I made up. They're classical liberal democratic values, the values in the name of which the revolutions were fought centuries ago that brought down the quasi-feudal ancien regime and gave us the modern world of liberal capitalist democracies, which as a socialist, I think was a long step in the right direction, but didn't go far enough. So those values are, in the original French, liberté, égalité, fraternité, or roughly freedom, equality, and social solidarity. Equality and solidarity are maybe obvious enough. Under capitalism, everyone is formally legally equal, but some people have hundreds or thousands of times the material resources and hence the economic power over others. You don't have to be an absolutist by saying that everyone always needs to get precisely the same share of the pie, no matter what, to see that this kind of towering, absurd inequality is obscene. And social solidarity means treating absolutely everyone as a member of the community of people that we care about. Not just saying, hey, good luck, but you're on your own. If you end up sleeping on the street or you end up having to work 3 jobs to keep a roof over your head, that's a you problem. But I think the case for socialism from equality and solidarity is relatively straightforward. The most interesting part of all this to me is the part about freedom, because I suspect that Walter is going to base his entire case on that, at least as far as the normative question goes. So let's zero in on the disagreement there in the time we have left. The deontic libertarian theory of freedom is that the most important kind of freedom is freedom from interference. We own ourselves, we own external property, no one has a right to interfere with either one. But there are two very basic problems here. The first is that this is a radically uninformative account of freedom, because it doesn't say, it can't say that we have a right to whatever property we actually happen to possess. If it said that, you couldn't even recover stolen property. And it doesn't say, it can't say that it's wrong to take away whatever property you have a legal claim to, because if it said that, the principle couldn't be used to resist, redistributive taxation or even nationalization. If we passed a law to nationalize Amazon and turn it over to the workers, and if you want to say that would be unconstitutional, let's say we passed a constitutional amendment and then we did it, then Jeff Bezos's legal rights to that property wouldn't be violated. So what it necessarily means to say that you can't interfere with somebody's property is not that you can't interfere with the property people happen to have, or even the property they're legally entitled to have, but you can't interfere with the property that they're morally entitled to have. But that's the whole issue and dispute. 100% of what the argument about the ethics of redistribution is about is precisely about who's entitled to what property. So that's one issue. I think that freedom from interference is largely a red herring. The other issue is I don't even think it's the most fundamental kind of freedom. I think the most fundamental kind of freedom is freedom from domination. A slave who's whipped every day is more interfered with than one with a kind master, but the second slave isn't more free than the first. And even if it's not as bad as slavery or capital or feudalism, in a capitalist society where most people don't have access to the means of production, so they have no realistic way of supporting themselves except by submitting themselves to the dictates of an unelected boss, we have less of that kind of freedom than we'd have if we extend democracy from politics to economics.
Okay, well done. Within the 10-minute time frame. So let me reset the clock to 10 minutes. Okay, Walter,
I've reset the clock, and now it is your turn to present the case for, as I understand it, laissez-faire capitalism.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for Ben for organizing this. It's a pleasure. John Stuart Mill said the only way we can ever get to the truth is by hearing both sides in a polite way, and I'm sure based on my previous debates with Ben, that will ensue this time as well. Okay, so what is the case for laissez-faire capitalism? One of my favorite Thomas Sowell quotes, and I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell, is, quote, "It is hard to imagine a more stupid or more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong." So capitalism, if you make an error, you misunderstand what the consumer wants, you keep producing hula hoops when people don't want it anymore, or you're in a mom and pop grocery and the supermarket comes in, namely you used to satisfy customers, but you no longer do, you automatically go out of business. When's the last time that any government entity, except for Donald Trump, forget about him for the moment, but when's the last time that a government entity ever went broke by screwing up? The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, screwed up on thalidomide. The centralized medical people screwed up on COVID. Did they go broke? No, they never go broke. They pay no price for being wrong. Whereas if McDonald's doesn't do the right thing and they give us a bad burger, or God forbid they kill people, there'll be no more McDonald's, and it'll be automatic. You don't have to pass any laws or anything like that. So capitalism is a system where if you make a mistake and you don't produce good things that the consumers want at a low price, you get outcompeted. And that's why we have a lot of good things. We have good shoes, we have good violins, we have good cars, we have good, I don't know what, computers, because if the people who are producing those things don't do it well, they get supplanted by other people. Whereas if the fire department or the library or the post office doesn't do a good job, well, that's it. They sort of stay there forever. Okay, so that's one point. Another point is that under capitalism, we consumers have much more control over producers than we as voters have over politicians who would be in charge of the socialist part of the economy. For example, how often is the dollar vote used? I don't know, every day, 3 times a day, 5 times a day, whenever people go shopping, whether to a grocery store or a pharmacy or online, they're voting dollars. When do we have a political vote? Well, every 4 years, maybe every 2 years. So the point is that if you want to have control at the bottom, if you want to have some sort of responsibility, the more often you can, I don't say crack the whip, but the more often you can register your pleasure or your displeasure, your thumbs up or your thumbs down, the better. And capitalism beats socialism or democracy hands down. The next one is focus. Suppose we just had an election between Kamala and Donald, and suppose I like Donald's programs 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and I also like Kamala's programs 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I have no way. I have to take a package deal. I can't say, well, I want one from column A and one from column B, and I like Kamala on this, and I want her to do that program, and I want Donald to do that. No. Whereas on the market, I could buy a violin, I could buy a motorcycle, I could buy I don't know, a chair, I could buy a frisbee. Namely, I can have a very narrow focus. Another one is rational ignorance. If I want to buy a motorcycle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask some people who have motorcycles, well, which one's the good one? What should I watch out for? I'm going to go online and ask about this. I'm going to maybe go to Consumer Reports. I'm going to find out about motorcycles, and I'm going to know a bit about motorcycles. Because if I don't, then I'm not going to get a good motorcycle, and people have an incentive to be rational in the market. Do we have an incentive to be rational in the political sphere as well? No, because look, first of all, my vote is one of millions and it's not going to even have any effect. Secondly, I'm a dummy. I know nothing about anything and I just go by who smiles better. And somebody else is an expert, a total expert on everything political. And how many votes does that guy get? One, the same as me. So what you have is input of ignorance into the political system, whereas you have input into rationality into the market. Another benefit of capitalism vis-a-vis socialism is unanimity. Every time anyone acts in the market, there's unanimity. I bought this shirt, I don't know, $10. There was unanimous agreement. I agreed to buy it. The guy who sold it to me agreed to sell it to me. And there was perfect unanimity. And all the market consists of is voluntary trades. And in each and every voluntary trade, there's unanimity. Is there unanimity in the government sector? Are you kidding? I mean, Donald won, I don't know how many votes he got, maybe 49%, Kamala 48, something like that, or maybe he got 51, but there was no unanimity. In the market, you have unanimity, and in the political sphere, you don't. And surely unanimity is better than non-unanimity. There are two kinds of socialism. One is, well, actually, there are three. One is the ownership, the government ownership of all the means of production. And Ben doesn't favor that, so I'm not going to deliberate too much on that. But that's one type of socialism. Another type of socialism is from each according to his each, from each according to each, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's another definition of socialism. And as long as that's done on a voluntary basis, that's okay. I'm a socialist. I'm sure Ben will be happy to know that in that sense, he and I are fellow socialists. I mean, the average family, when my little girl was 3 years old, she ate food in accordance, not with her ability to earn income, but in accordance with her ability, her need. So that's okay. And now there's another way of looking at it, and that is voluntary or coercive. Voluntary socialism would be the kibbutz or the commune or the family. And they could practice from each to each. And as long as it's voluntary, that's fine. But the kind of socialism, what do they call it? Democratic socialism that Ben is advocating is not voluntary socialism. It's coercive socialism. You're in the commune whether you like it or not. And I think that this is a violation of rights to tell people that they have to join. I'm not a joiner. I don't want to join the socialist commune. If socialism is so great, why don't the socialists just practice it among the people who agree to be part of it? Why do they compel other people like me to be part of it, even though we don't want to be part of it? I just want to mention a little bit about East Germany and West Germany. They were the same people, the same culture, the same history, the same IQ, the same ability, the same characteristics, same everything. And the same for North and South Korea. And due to an accident of war, East Germany went one way, West Germany went the other way. And at the end of this, people in East Germany were trying to leave, and they were being shot as they were leaving. Now, I know that Ben doesn't favor this. He favors Sweden and Norway. And I just have a book here. It's a Economic Freedom of the World. And those countries, the Scandinavian countries, are in the top 10% of economic freedom. So if he and Bernie Sanders favor that, just as I was a socialist before, they're really capitalists, because these are among the most free countries, economically free countries in the world. And with that, my 10 minutes are up.
Okay. Thank you, Walter. So in accord with the format, I'm going to set the timer to 5 minutes and allow Ben a chance to respond to Walter's opening.
Ben, you have to turn your microphone on.
Yes,
That's
I did.
better.
All right. The first thing I want to point out is that Walter gave us a defense of markets, which is a different thing from a defense of capitalism. Markets existed for thousands of years before the rise of capitalism, and probably in any version of socialism that we know how to make work logistically at this point in history, we probably need market mechanisms for some things. But what makes something capitalism, socialism, feudalism, right? What makes it one economic system rather than another is who are the immediate producers, right? The people who are actually working, and how are they then related to whoever is controlling the means of production? Do you have capitalists and wage workers? Do you have lords and serfs? Do you have associations of workers who are collectively running the means of production? And a lot of what Walter is talking about with regards to how if the company that makes hula hoops makes bad hula hoops, the market punishes them, and this works so well that this is why we have good shoes, good violins, good cars, good computers. I would say a couple of things. So part of what he's latching onto is a real thing, right? This is the calculation problem that there's that right now, right, it's a very difficult problem about how centralized planning can coordinate, production with fine-grained consumer needs. But I would also say that the extent of that problem is an empirical question. It cannot be answered a priori. And in fact, we know, right, from extensive empirical observation over experiments that have taken place over decades and decades, we know that there are some things that can be quite effectively planned outside of the market. Healthcare, for example, where all of those countries that I mentioned earlier that have non-market healthcare systems do a much better job, that they have, like, by every ranking, for the World Health Organization, whatever you want, they have, those are more successful healthcare systems than ours are. They have lower rates of mortality amenable to healthcare, which is stats nerd speak for the rate of people who die who would have lived if they had timely medical intervention. Similarly, Walter mentions, when he said, if the fire department, the library, the post office don't do a good job, they just stay there forever. I think it shouldn't take a lot of imagination to see how much of a nightmare it would be to privatize any of those things. And I particularly point out that the U.S. Postal Service consistently ranks as one of the very most popular parts of the federal government for obvious reasons, right? You're not going to get a private company with the incentive to take a letter from, Southern California to rural Alaska for less than $1, right? That you need something where you remove profit incentives to make that possible. I also want to address, because while I'm on the empirical point, I want to address this business about the Fraser Institute, those economic, freedom of the world rankings. I believe that is Fraser. I actually wrote an article about this for Jacobin in 2021. I have a hyperlink to it in my last response to Walter in Merion West. But basically, I'm happy to get into this if we have, as we go on. But basically, I don't think the Fraser rankings meaningfully rank anything or are meaningful evidence of anything, except for how creative think tank hacks can be when their job is to put numbers into the blender again and again until they get the results that they want. I think if you find yourself saying, for example, that Norway and Sweden, which are full of exactly the kinds of programs that I support and Walter does not, right? Socialized healthcare, tuition-free higher education, et cetera, if you find yourself saying that, those places are less socialist than, say, Haiti, which ranks as, as much less economically free On the Fraser rankings, something has gone horribly wrong. I think the results speak for themselves. At one point, the Fraser rankings actually said that Ukraine in 2005 was less economically free than it had been in 1980, which shows you that something is completely wacky about the Fraser methodology. This just does not show what they want to show. And finally, I want to point out that with all this business about voluntary socialism and involuntary socialism, Walter is doing exactly what I talked about in my opening statement, that he's talking about this as if non-interference did any heavy lifting in showing what the distribution could be, which it cannot for reasons that I got into.
Okay, thank you, Ben. So we will proceed to Walter for his 5-minute reply to Ben's reply.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, is the same thing as free enterprise or free markets. I use them as synonyms. I don't see any gigantic difference. As far as health insurance, Ben, why not allow, and this is a rhetorical question because it's my 5 minutes, why not allow those people that want to join, let them join? Why coerce other people to join when they don't want to join? This isn't freedom. Now I ask, why is it that medical expense is so expensive? And the answer is because of the institutions that Ben favors. The big part of GDP is labor. Labor accounts for some 70-75% of the GDP. The big part of medical expense is doctors' salaries. Why are doctors' salaries so high? In some of my research, what I did is I compared doctors' salaries with people who I thought could have been doctors had they been allowed into medical school, namely PhDs in chemistry or biology or something like that. And the ratio was something like 6-2. They make 6 times as much doctors as PhDs in biochem or something like that. And I assume biochem PhDs could have been doctors if they were let into medical school. But they're not let into medical schools because we have the AMA, which restricts entry. I have a cousin who's now a doctor, and the first year he applied after he graduated, he applied to 10 schools, he got into none. The next time he applied to every school in the country, he got into none, and he finally got his medical degree in Europe, and then he came back and had to have a big fight to get in. So this is one of the reasons why it's so expensive. And then we talk about the redistribution. Why should we take, that's just theft. Why should we, by the way, Ben, you have a nice head of hair. Take a look at me. I don't have too much. Shouldn't we go to Ben and grab some of his hair and put it into me if we could? Well, I don't think so, but that's the same thing. Ben's hair, he owns that hair. He also owns his eyeglasses. He owns his shirt. He owns his money. And if I come and grab it on the grounds that he's a little richer than someone else and I'm going to give it to someone else, I'm a thief. And thievery is not good. Pinochet. Milton Friedman went down there to Pinochet, not to support Pinochet, but to convert Pinochet to free enterprise. He also went to China to convert the Chinese to free. I mean, he was a Johnny One Note, and I mean this is a compliment. And his one note was free enterprise, and he was converting the Chinese commies and the Pinochet fascists. He didn't care. Convert everyone to freedom. And somehow lefties got on his case about Pinochet and never mentioned China. Look, every time that there's a commercial activity, both sides gain. I bought the shirt for $10. How much did I value the shirt when I bought it? More than 10, not equal to 10. There'd be no profit in it for me. The guy who sold it had many shirts and he valued it probably at $1. So there's mutual gain every time in the free enterprise system, whereas you can't say that with socialism. Some people gain, other people lose, and it's the devil's work to try to figure out whether the gains are greater than the losses. You can't figure it. Now, he mentions that the mortality rate is lower in places that have governmental health care. Is this because of that or in spite of that? That's a crucial question. I say it's in spite of the fact that they have that. That's why they're doing so well. Ben says it's because of, but he's got no evidence for that. Another point is, what have I got here? Oh yeah, the worker control. Let's suppose that we're all workers and we live on this island, and what we do is we pick, I don't know, coconuts and pineapples. And the three of us are on the island, and we each are separate. And now all of a sudden I go to Jonathan, I say, hey, Jonathan, come work for me and I'll pay you more. And we all collect 10 units of food every day. And I say, Jonathan, come work for me. I'll give you 11 units. How am I going to get the 11 units? Because when the two of us work together, we together can produce more than double each one of us. That's how I got rich, by creating something, whereas I didn't employ Ben, and Ben is an independent producer and he's poor. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Walter. I suspect Ben wants to reply, and I would like to hear what Ben has to say, and then obviously what Walter will have to say and respond to that. So let's go with 3 minutes apiece, and then we'll proceed to a question that I'd like to ask.
Who goes first?
Yeah,
that will be Ben.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So on health insurance, Walter insists that the fact that there are all of these other countries that that have universal health care that are available to everybody, free at the point of service. So nobody in those societies is holding off on getting something checked out that could be cancer or it could be nothing, because they're afraid of how much they'd have to pay out of pocket because they don't have health insurance, or even they're afraid of the copay because they do have health insurance. That all of the good results in terms of mortality amenable to healthcare are a complete coincidence. And he says, I can't prove that it's not a coincidence. We can have some kind of human skepticism here about, basic procedures of evidence when we're ranking systems in different countries, in which case I would point out that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, that in addition to the wacky results that I mentioned earlier, this would also be a problem with all those economic freedom rankings, right? How do you know that the good things in these societies are because they rank higher on economic freedom? Perhaps it's all a crazy coincidence. Perhaps even East Germany's economic system, had nothing to do with why things were worse in East Germany. I think this is very silly. I also think that blaming the medical costs on the U.S. being insufficiently laissez-faire sits very uncomfortably with the global evidence. The U.S. already has one of the most laissez-faire healthcare systems in the world, certainly the most laissez-faire health system in the developed world, and it has spectacularly bad results. At this point, this just sounds like ideological dogma. But what I really want to focus on, because in the opening, I explained why, saying, oh, redistribution is bad because it's theft, because it's coercion, is just blatantly begging the question. It's arguing in a circle. It's assuming the thing that you're trying to prove. That, because after all, what you have to mean is that it's wrong to interfere with property to which people are morally entitled, which is just a roundabout way of saying it's wrong because it's wrong. All this business about it's theft, it's aggression, this is just the philosophical equivalent of the street magician talking the entire time that he's doing his trick. So you look at his face instead of looking at his hands. The heavy lifting is never being done by this principle about aggression or theft, right? The heavy lifting is always being done by the theory of property rights, the theory of who is in fact entitled to what. And that is what 100% of the real argument is about.
Okay, so before we proceed to a question, Walter, you have an opportunity to respond.
I just wanted to finish my point about worker control. The reason workers can't get control is because I own the company. I built it up by making voluntary trades with people, and I'm Bill Gates, and I am very, very rich. How did I get rich? I made better computers. And this idea of democracy, economic democracy, is just theft. This idea of it's a circular argument, no. Remember, every time that there's a commercial activity interaction, there's mutual benefit ex ante, not ex post always. Sometimes after the fact, people regret their decision, but ex ante, there's always benefit, a mutual benefit, and the socialists can't say anything like that at all. Then there's the post office. You can't privatize the post office. Well, we had private post offices. Wells Fargo and Pony Express and what's that one that delivers packages? I forget the name of it. We've had private companies deliver, and whenever they deliver, they do it at a much lower cost. Ben makes much of the case that medical service is free at the point of service. True. But what does that mean? If you take a basic supply and demand curve and you put in free, the demand is greater than the supply. If it costs me something, I might consider, well, should I go to the doctor or not? But if it's free and I'm lonely and I need to speak to somebody and the doctor will speak to me, I'll go in there. So what the Fraser Institute does, and I used to be a part of it, and I uphold their analysis of countries, but now I'm talking about something different. What they do is they measure waiting times. And there was this lovely case where a woman and her horse both had the same problem, a kidney problem. And the woman went to the doctor to fix her kidney, and it took, 18 months to get fixed. And they took the horse to a vet to get the horse's kidney fixed, and they did it right away, well, within a day or so. And the point is that if they didn't do it right away, she would have been put in jail for animal cruelty. Well, this is human cruelty. So again, I asked Ben, if you think that this program is so great, why compel everyone to join it? Why not just take all of you guys and say, okay, we're going to have socialized medicine. You can't come, but we're going to have socialized medicine, and you'll get free this and free that, and everything will be hunky-dory. Why do you insist on compelling people who don't want to join? I mean, it just seems like, highly problematic. Public education. We've had, I'll talk about public education next time.
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to ask a question. The point is to ask a question for each of you. The first one will be to Ben, so it'll be a question that I guess in some sense challenges his argument. And I'm going to set it to 5 minutes. And the question is, Amazon comes up in your essay, and you've mentioned it tonight, and this kind of feeds into one of the points that Walter was just making. I think that we can all appreciate the sense of more democratic participation in an Amazon warehouse, the kind of worker cooperative argument. But the idea of nationalizing Amazon, or say some other company or what have you, kind of going all the way with socialism. It seems to me that this brings us to a very basic point about property rights from the standpoint of an economist, and at least, without getting into the philosophy, mixing your labor and all that property rights is meant as a kind of incentive. And so we can go back to 1994, whenever it was, Ben Bezos is conceiving his idea for the company, and goes on to build this great company. But then back then he thinks to himself, well, 30 years from now, the company is going to nationalize my company, so why should I even bother? And it seems like that would be a real problem with just the basic incentive for innovation in an economy. And I can think of ways of addressing that, but that would be me answering the question rather than you. So I'll let you kind of take that over.
Is there a time clock for this?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of different questions inside that question. So this is because there's one of them is a question about like instability and expectations that, if we that if we transition from one system to another, that expectations that people formed under the previous system, won't hold anymore. That they'll be told that these were the rules, and if you play by this rule, then you'll be rewarded in the future, and then the rules change, right? And of course, that's going to be true. That's going to be trivially true anytime that you have a change of systems. I think that we agree, though, that some change of systems were good, right? That slave owners who invested lots of resources in plantations, having the rules changed on them, for example, was a good thing, right? So, of course, obviously, you want a new system that will then be stable going forward, right? But if you put a lot of weight in you can't have instability and defeated expectations, then you just end up saying that whatever the status quo happens to be at whatever part of history you've landed on just has to stay that way forever, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is an alternate defense of property rights. So as I said earlier, the attempt to defend property rights based on non-coercion, or the idea that redistribution is theft, is simply circular. It doesn't work. All of the heavy lifting, right? Because you're never saying people are entitled to what they have a legal right to, because then nationalization would be fine. You're not saying they're entitled to what they happen to be currently in possession of, or else even recovered stolen property, would be a problem. You're always saying they're entitled to, they're entitled to what they have a moral claim on, which is just a way of saying that they're entitled to what they're entitled to. All of the work is always being done by the substantive theory of who is entitled to what resources. Talking about non-aggression or redistribution being theft is always a red herring. It's always circular. Okay, but this is a pragmatic defense of it, that we need the right to private property, not just the kind of private property that both capitalist and socialist theories of entitlement are going to agree on, right? Your right to your person, your personal possessions, your glasses, your shirt, whatever. But the right to private property, the means of production. That we need that to provide incentives for innovation, and that is an empirical question. And I would point out, right, Walter said earlier, Bill Gates got rich through the free market. Well, not really, right? Because by his lights, we don't have a free market, right? We have the only thing we've ever had is a market that's heavily propped up, right? Certainly in any kind of complex, thriving market economy, a market that's heavily propped up by all sorts of state intervention, going from enforcement of intellectual property to fiat currency, without which it would be impossible to have a stable functioning economy, through all sorts of mechanisms to prop up private enterprise, very much included in innovation, right? So the only TED Talk I ever would recommend that people watch, generally I find those annoying, is Mariana Mazzucato's. She wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State. And one of the things she does in this talk is she'll hold up an iPhone and say, let's talk about all of the components of this that make it a smartphone, not a dumb phone. So that would be the touchscreen technology, the GPS, the internet itself, all of these things. None of them were a result of private sector innovation. All of them were developed in the public sector, in the Department of Defense, in public universities, in labs with federal funding. So I think, as an empirical matter, the idea that innovation in technology has to happen within the private sector is just not true. Now, could it be true that you need some of it to happen there? That even though the public sector in practice does quite a bit of the heavy lifting, and we probably would not have these things I just mentioned without it, that some of it needs to be done in the private sector. If so, then I would say, like the calculation problem, that might give you a reason to say, okay, we can make the things public that we know from experience, from empirical testing, the public sector is good at. If we still need a real market sector for some things, this can at least be a market sector of worker-owned firms like Mondragon in Spain, which I mentioned earlier, which in fact does a fair amount of technological innovation.
Okay, thank you. And Walter, you have an opportunity to respond.
Okay, thank you. Ben says that without fiat currency, we'd be up the creek without a paddle. I'm putting words in his mouth, but that was the gist of what he said. Well, we had the gold standard for many years, and we weren't up the creek. I would say that the reason we had the Great Depression was because of the fiat currency. Look, the government takes half the GDP. It would be amazing if they never did anything good. So I accept that Ben's point about, well, they made some contributions to high tech, but this is nothing to write home about. It'd be amazing with half the GDP if they never did anything decent. So they did some stuff decent, and I acknowledge that. Public education. The reason we had public education, it was an attack on Catholics by Protestants. What happened in the 1870s, 1880s, when public schools started, and before we had public schools in the late 19th century, we still had education. The problem was that the Protestants didn't much like these Catholics having Catholic schools because they were teaching popery and other evil things. But they weren't powerful enough to prohibit it. So what they did, they were very smart. They said, let's have private schools and we'll tax the Catholics for it. So the Catholics will have to pay twice, once for their own private schools and once for our schools through taxes. So private schools started out not very nicely. What are they like now? They try to get 12-year-old kids to change their sex without telling the parents. And when the parents object to this in a meeting, then they call them terrorists, and they teach them DEI and stuff like that. Why can't we have private schools? Some of the best schools are Catholic schools, and they teach everybody, and I don't see any big problem with that. So I'm not a big fan of public schools. Prices are very important. If we don't have prices, we're at sea without a rudder, or up the creek without a paddle, or whatever you want to say. And to the extent that we have government intervention, we don't have prices that tell us anything. When you give stuff away for free, you get, as I was mentioning, the woman with the horse, and they both had kidney problems. There's a gigantic waiting list, and this is something that the Fraser Institute has done very well. They've listed how long does it take to get service, and Canada is one of the places that Ben talks about as a great idea. Whenever you give something away for free, demand is greater than supply, because supply and demand is like a cross, and at the bottom, demand is greater than supply. So people will go to a doctor for frivolous reasons, whereas if they had to pay something, and they would pay a lot less if there were more doctors allowed, and they're not allowed. And this idea of circularity, I just don't get that idea of circularity. Look, I'm now the employer, and Jonathan and Ben are my employees. What am I contributing to the enterprise? Well, one thing I'm contributing to the enterprise is, and we're going to make pens like this. And how long is it going to take for the first pen to come off the assembly line? 1 year, let's say. Well, what are we going to do for salary for that 1 year? I'm going to pay you guys a salary for that 1 year. You could have gone off on your own, you two employees of mine. You could have set up your workers' co-op, but you didn't have the money, and you didn't want to do it. And also risk. Now I paid you a year's salary, and guess what? Nobody wants these pens. Do I now come back to you and I say, hey, I got bad news for you. Give me back the salary that I paid you for a year. No, I'm the risk bearer. If the pens sell, I'm the claimant, residual claimant. And if they don't sell, I bear the risk. So look, this idea of workers' co-ops and economic democracy, yes, if you guys want to do it, go do it. Nobody's stopping you. You can have workers co-ops or whatever you want. Nobody is stopping you. And look, the reason that I got rich when I first hired Jonathan for 11 coconuts instead of the 10 that we all got is because I had some entrepreneurship going on. That's how I got rich. If we had this situation where everyone was equal and some people started employing others, it was a voluntary thing and the employers got rich. So I don't see any circularity here at all.
Okay, let's do one more back and forth with 3 minutes apiece. We're about 10 minutes away from an hour. like to get a second question in, but and if so, maybe on the back and forth, we'll go down maybe to 2 minutes, but we'll just see. But for now, let's do 3 minutes apiece to reply to each other.
Who goes first?
Ben,
so,
just because he's replying to you right now.
Okay.
Yeah. The inference from micro level individual transactions, A agrees to make pens for B, right? C buys B's pens. The inference from that being mutually advantageous to all participants in the moment to the conclusion that macro level social arrangements that emerge from all this must be in the interests of the majority of the population, never mind the entire population, pretty blatantly commits the composition fallacy. It's like moving from the premise that all the individual molecules in the Brooklyn Bridge are invisible to the naked eye to the conclusion that a bridge itself is invisible. An example that I used in my last reply to Walter at Merion West is, if we didn't have sexual harassment laws, the secretary who takes a job where she has to put up with the groping attentions of her boss to keep her position is making a decision more to her advantage than being thrown into unemployment, especially if she lives in an anarcho-capitalist society with no unemployment benefits. Nevertheless, laws against private sector sexual harassment are pretty clearly in the interests of secretaries. So it doesn't follow at all from the fact that, yes, given the total circumstances somebody is in at a particular moment, that it's more advantageous for them to engage in a market transaction than to not engage from it. It doesn't follow from that therefore, whatever emerges from all these transactions is in the interests of most people, right? So one of the things that Walter said earlier was that we get to vote with our dollars so much more often than we get to vote in the ballot box. True enough, of course, some of us have a lot more votes than others in that case, but also even when it comes to the voting with our dollars that we all do get to do, because those things are a package deal too, right? It's not just, do I want, for example, people at, do I want people to be paid over $15 an hour, for example, so I'm going to buy this cereal rather than that cereal because the producers of it make over $15 an hour. No, it's a package deal with the taste of the cereal and how much it costs, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is why you have all these states where you've never gotten $15 an hour through voting through your dollar, but you do get it through popular referendums. Really quickly on Canada, I would just say that that Canadian healthcare has much better outcomes than American healthcare overall. We have, there's a reason why even conservative politicians in Canada can't run on a platform of getting rid of it. They would never win another election. And the last thing, I know it's going to start making its music, but just let me finish the sentence, is that I just want to point out that it's nothing to brag about if you have shorter lines, not because you hire more doctors, but because you kicked people out of line for not being able to pay. I think that's a moral disgrace.
Okay, I'm going to give you, Walter, 15 extra seconds. And you can reply now.
Ben mentions unemployment. Why do we have unemployment? Mainly because of the minimum wage law. Most people think minimum wage law is sort of a law that raises wages. The higher it is, the more wages. Well, if so, why not make it $1 million a year and we'd all be rich? We could stop foreign aid and just tell these poor countries, hey, put in a minimum wage, you'll be rich. Before the advent of the minimum wage, the unemployment rate of white and black was about the same. The unemployment rate of older people and teenagers about the same. Nowadays, the unemployment rate of black teens is quadruple the unemployment rate of white middle-aged people. Why? Because the minimum wage is not a floor that raises wages. It's a barrier over which you have to jump. And the higher it is, the harder it is to get over it. And this is part and part. Bernie Sanders loves the minimum wage and he wants to raise it to $20. Well, if my productivity is $15 an hour and the minimum wage law is $20, anyone who hires me is going to lose $5 an hour. Now, this idea of taking money away from rich people and giving it to poor people, I try to grab some of Ben's hair. He wasn't donating any of it, and I could use it. And look at how much he's got. Not fair. Look, you take away money from the rich guy, and he's got less of an incentive to be rich. You give money to a poor guy, and he's got more incentive to be poor. This is not the way to run a railroad. This is not the way to run an economy. This is not the way to have prosperity. Now, with the sexual harassment business, we're getting into prostitution now. Look, what determines wages in the first place? What determines wages is productivity. My productivity, I can pick apples at $40 an hour. My wage will tend to be 40 an hour. Jonathan can pick apples at 50 an hour. His wage will tend to be 50. Why will my wage tend to be 50? Because if it's 55, they'll lose money on hiring me. And if it's 45, someone else will hire me at 46. So wages tend to equal productivity. So when Jonathan mentions sexual productivity, we're now talking about prostitution. Namely, a person who's a secretary part-time and a prostitute part-time. They make a lot of money. Ben is giving the impression that they're desperate and they have to use sex much against their will. But why are they unemployed in the first place? Why are they so desperate in the first place? Not because of capitalism, not because of free enterprise, but because of government interferences with the free enterprise system. If there were no minimum wage law, something that is just beloved of all Democratic Socialists, Bernie Sanders, my old buddy, really loves it. This has played havoc with the people who can least afford to be unemployed. So Ben is trying to give us a little pity party for the poor, unfortunate woman that's so desperate that she can't get another job that she has to adhere to sexual harassment. But it all stems from the problem from the.
Okay, thank you, Walter. I want to proceed to a question that I now have for Walter. And I guess Walter can go first on this. This may be a question that, kind of as Ben says, has several questions in it, but it gets to the sense that I'm picking up here that Walter is arguing more in the way of principles, and Ben is trying to focus on sort of empirical issues. The question is, one of the reasons I do this thing at night is because, like many of us, I have a day job. And that day job for me is I work in the government. And despite what Elon Musk would say about lower productivity workers, I work for an agency that's actually quite widely respected by left, right, and everybody. It's EIA, Energy Statistics and Analysis. So basically, information is a public good. So it's one of the few agencies that doesn't really have any political enemies right now. Now, I mention that because we're obviously going through a time now in which Musk is essentially trying to slash the government. And hopefully I will escape that. I do have very high performance ratings and so on. I will say that I am in the fossil fuels analyst. I've written anti-woke books. The point being that I'm not like some lefty ideologue in the government that they have to root out of the government and so on. So hopefully I'll turn out okay. But where I'm going with this is the question of luck. So I don't really like to talk about it because I don't like to claim the mantle of victim. But I'll just let you know that I have brain cancer, particularly a brain tumor, and it's been manageable for 8 years now. Mainly because it's not a glioblastoma yet anyway. And I have a great team at Johns Hopkins. They manage it. Hopefully they can continue to manage it because I have a very good healthcare plan as an employee of the federal government. And like I say, I think I provide a good service to the public. But let's just say that by sheer bad luck, I get the hammer from our great entrepreneur, Elon Musk. And, you mentioned some of your articles about saving, about being entrepreneurial. I've certainly tried to do all of that in my life. Didn't necessarily start off with wealth at all. I've actually lived in a shelter when I was a kid. I working class background, so on. So, but I've tried to, I've voted Republican and so on in the past. So basically I tried to toe that line, but just by sheer luck, I could find myself in a position without health insurance and without income. And you could say, okay, well, I'll get another job. But it just so happens also that I might be facing another brain surgery this year. In fact, very likely, given developments in my scan. And then they want to put me on a therapy that might, basically allow me to kind of preserve my life and a little bit longer and so on. And of course, that all goes away without health insurance. And as you know, as an economist, we can talk about transactions, mutual beneficial transactions, but there are such things as transaction costs, search costs, negotiation costs, enforcement costs. So it's not so easy to just go get another job. And finally, I'll just mention that it might not be a surprise that brain cancer has a lot of side effects, one of which for me is sleep disruption, chronic, and so on and so forth, which requires a lot of adjustments throughout the day. So remote work happens to be a very good accommodation for me, so on and so forth. Sorry to go into a little personal soapbox, but I thought it might dramatize the question that, sure, in a market system, there's a lot of free, it's about free transactions, according to price discovery, and so on. But in a laissez-faire system, and or capitalist system, or whatever, it seems that the response that perspective has to my situation is, well, tough luck. Is that the case?
Jonathan, I'm shocked and dismayed with your story. I didn't realize that you had this medical problem. And
well, I don't like to talk about it too much, but given the situation, I feel compelled.
That's okay, and I'm sure Ben joins me in wishing you the best of health and full recovery. Ben and I don't agree on much, but I'm sure we agree on that.
Thank you.
Let me respond to you in the order of the points you made. You're providing information. And you say, I provide a good service. Well, how do you know? Nobody volunteer. Is the clock on for me now?
So let me just say, Let me just say that Project 2025, which is the blueprint for the GOP, specifically describes EIA as not a problematic agency, provides independent, impartial analysis, is widely respected, and is widely used by many stakeholders, including people in Congress, the business community. So their own blueprint has good things to say about that industry based on their understanding of the stakeholders involved.
Would you put me back up to 5 minutes?
Sure thing, yes.
Okay, great.
There we go. Sorry.
We're 24.
There we go.
Murray Rothbard wrote an essay called Statistics, the Achilles heel of Government. And he wanted to ban all governmental informational generating institutions such as your own. And I agree with him entirely. Without these statistics, we'd have a lot less central planning, and central planning is a very bad thing. We should have planning from the bottom up for the market. You say, by the way, there is private generation of statistics or private generation of information, Consumer Reports. Every newspaper is providing information. There are private sources of information, and the benefit of a private source of information is that they can go broke if the consumers don't like it, whereas your institution can't go broke unless Donald shapes up and wants to get rid of your group as well. And I favor not getting rid of your group, privatizing it. And if it's so good, then somebody should be willing to pay for the service, just like we pay for Consumer Report, we pay for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal which also provide information. You say, I provide a good service. You have no proof of that. just because a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington under Donald Trump say that you do, I don't know. No cash was put on the barrelhead and saying, yes, I want that service and I'm willing to pay for it. Rather, your salary comes through taxes, and taxes are compulsory. And again, if people want this service, let them buy it. I keep asking Ben if medical insurance or medical coverage is so great. If his program is so great, but why doesn't he content himself with doing it on a voluntary basis? Why does he have to draft people? He talks about slavery. Why does he have to enslave us into this system? And Jonathan, I say the same thing to you. Why should you get away with compelling me to pay taxes to pay for your salary? It's unjust. Now, with regard to your medical situation, I did mention that a big part of medical expenses are doctor salaries, and that doctor salaries are up into the stratosphere. And why is that? Because whenever supply shifts to the left, prices go up. And the AMA has shifted those supply curves way to the left. And also, here's another program, beloved of Ben, DEI, or affirmative action. Those people at Johns Hopkins, half of them don't belong there. Half of them, well, I don't know about half, but some of them don't belong there because they're only there because of affirmative action. And if it weren't for affirmative action, the people at Johns Hopkins would be a hell of a lot better, and they might have already cured you. Now, I have to make another point. I favor privatizing school buses. School buses shouldn't be private. Sorry, I'm under Ben's influence here. Shouldn't be public. Stop that, Ben. I'm kidding, of course. How should this work? Here's a school bus full of kids, and now it's in the middle of, I don't know, Montana in the winter. And what happens is that the bus driver gets the word that school buses are no longer public. And you know what this illegitimate person does? He gets out of there and he leaves all the kids to freeze to death. Is that any way to have privatization? No, it's a transition period. In other words, what your plight is due to Jonathan's plight is due to Ben's policies. And now all of a sudden we have Jonathan has a problem, and he wants instantaneous solution. Well, you're not going to get any instantaneous solution. It takes a while to privatize and have the benefits of many more doctors and doctors who belong there. Nowadays in medical school, you know what they're doing? They're having DEI in medical school, and they're having even for airline pilots, for God's sakes. Well, this is a policy that Ben favors too, if I understand him, although he hasn't mentioned this. This is death. So, Jonathan, you would be much better off if in the past 20 years we had free enterprise. You'd have better doctors at a lower price than now. And it's very unfair against the capitalist system to say, well, here I am bereft. I'm like a school child left in the cold because all of a sudden privatization was like that and we left people in the lurch. No, the way you privatize is you have to have a transition period. You don't just say, well, this all ends. Even Donald is having a bit of a transition.
Okay. Thank you, Walter. I will transition over to Ben for a reply. Oh, mute.
There we go. So the original question was about luck. And that, strikes me as a really serious, morally weighty reason to object to a given distribution. In fact, when Walter is defending capitalist property rights, you'll notice that he does it by talking about the things that he thinks that capitalists have done in order to merit having this, right? That they took all these risks, they innovated. And one point that you could make about that certainly is that Walter says that he doesn't understand the idea that it's circular, to say that it's wrong to take away the things that people are morally entitled to, but that really what's doing all the heavy lifting is the underlying theory of entitlement. But then when challenged on that point, he doesn't just defend himself in terms of freedom from interference, which is completely vacuous, right? He he defends himself on the grounds of that no, there's this substantive reason why these people deserve it, because they were risk takers, that they haven't taken a risk at one time, right? They deserve to reap the benefits at another time. Now, I would point out that the main risk they were taking was falling into the working class and thus being, down to the position of the people who, you're saying shouldn't have a say in what goes on in the workplaces where they have to spend half their lives. But that is a slightly different question. I would just point out that if you're going to have this kind of merit-based argument in defense of capitalist property rights, which is mostly, surprisingly, what I've heard, given my previous knowledge of Walter and his attachment to these deontic kind of Lockean arguments, it's going to be this issue about luck that Jonathan is raising is going to be a huge problem, right? Because it is very evidently, very often completely beyond the control of the person who gets the short end of the stick in any number of ways, right? People don't choose whether to be born into a family where you can be sent to a nice private school and have SAT tutors, or born into a poor family. People don't choose whether they're going to have the particular package of dispositions and talents that might help some people climb through ladders of class mobility, although structurally it's going to be impossible for everybody to do that, etc. So I think that that matters a lot, right? But of course, so that's an equality concern, that it's bad to have inequality where the people with the short end of the stick don't have any control over what leads them to have the short end of the stick. But there's also a question, right? I mean, I talked about three values in the opening, right? So there's also a question about freedom. And Walter has said several times, oh, you want to enslave people into universal health care, meaning that they have to pay taxes to support it, even if they would rather not. And I would say, so it's like, why do that? Why not just have mutual aid societies or something like that? Well, I would say that the empirical results are in, right? We know that one of these things works and one of them does not work. I would also say that even if you went further than Walter would even be willing to and had a public option, right, but also private health insurance, that is a formula for two-tiered healthcare for the rich and the poor. That you are, as is always the case in arrangements like that, you're going to have doctors, you're going to have clinics who won't take the public plan, which Walter will celebrate as an exercise of their freedom, but I think is a very ugly kind of society to end up with at the end. As far as doctors' salaries being in the stratosphere, he'll be happy to know that they're lower in countries with socialized medicine, I think for fairly straightforward reasons, given having a single payer, who can dictate price points. But nevertheless, right, lots of people in those societies still want to be doctors. And the stuff about affirmative action, I think, is a very strange non sequitur, but I'm running out of time, so I will just say, Jonathan, for whatever very little it's worth, thinking about you. So I'm really sorry to hear all of this.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. All right. So we are already way late on the main show ending. So I think there's like 20 minutes left of the debate, something like that.
Yeah, just about.
Yeah. So you can see the exciting conclusion of the debate, in which, as I recall, I haven't watched it since I did it, last Thursday, but as I recall. In whose next answer, Walter says, why is it a problem to have two-tier healthcare? We have two-tier everything, cars, homes, whatever. So, healthcare too. Which, people could draw their own conclusions about. And then the other thing we teased in the description for the title of the episode is at the very end, preview of coming attractions, he's going to argue that we should privatize highways. So different highway owners can conduct experiments on which speeds it's safe to drive at.
Oh man, my favorite is I'm very sorry to hear all of that medical news, but I didn't just lose 15 seconds, did I?
No,
yeah, no, sorry. I think what he said before was sweet. I just think that there's nothing that can.
The man is fixated on time limits, and
and that was kind
classically,
of
right? I mean, like back before me, right, when he was on the Majority Report or whatever, right? Like classically, the man is very concerned about his time.
And real quick, I think I was poking some fun about how neutral the moderator was, but it was pretty brave of him to put that out there. And as he said, it wasn't some kind of like leftist, which would be okay if it was, but it wasn't some kind of like leftist rant. You know, it was a real concern from someone who's seems like he's at least has heterodox opinions, if not slightly right wing. So I think, that was pretty powerful actually. So. I don't know if he would watch this, but if he did, I'll just say I appreciated that him putting that out.
Yeah. I mean, Walter,
it personalizes it for sure.
As you say, is definitely not a leftist. Oh, sorry, Walter. Jonathan is definitely not a leftist. More than Walter, you know. But like I've had like written, you know, like debates, you know, exchanges of articles with Jonathan about other things like years and years ago. And you know that we've had like huge political disagreements. I do think that his experience with the American healthcare system, my impression has been like sort of nudging him in at least a more social democratic direction recently, as it does many people. But he's clearly not a left-wing ideologue by any stretch of the imagination even now. Okay, well, we are going. Oh yeah, and I do. There's a regular presence in a lot of these chats. I think he's not there tonight, but who I had commented on social media when I sort of previewed some of what Walter would say in this debate, who expressed the hope that the argument for legalizing sexual harassment, because if a secretary decides that she'd prefer to be a part-time secretary and a part-time prostitute rather than being unemployed, that's nobody's business but hers and her boss. That this person had said that he really hoped that Walter would illustrate this with the stuffed animals that we remembered from the the toy animals we remembered from the Palestine debate. So that's my biggest disappointment about this debate. That we did.
There is hope that his discussion of two-tiered houses and cars means double-decker buses and multi-story houses.
Yeah. Well, you'll find out when we release the full version that includes this last 20 minutes, which I think is probably going to happen sometime next week. But on that note, I believe we have Jason Myles joining us in the post game. There's a little bit of question about that because we were doing simultaneous shows tonight, but it looks like he's wrapped. So I think that we're going to have him for that. So we are, I guess, unless there's any other housekeeping or anything we need to do. So we will go to that now. If you are already a GTAA patron, you should have a email with a hilariously unrealistic estimate about when we were going to start the post game in your inbox. If you are not, look, we're all reasonable people here. Nobody's going to confiscate your hair against your will or force you to become a podcast patron. But
we're hoarding a lot of hair on this panel now, and it's pretty fucked up.
Yeah, your right to not have the hair yanked out of your head is exactly the same as your right to every penny in your bank account. There are no relevant differences between those things. But yes, if you want to voluntarily, just like we could have Walter be fine with voluntary socialism, if workers get paid enough that they can just they can just buy up the means of production, or we could have voluntary minimum wage if bosses just decide that they want to pay people $15 an hour. voluntary sexual harassment protections, perhaps if, bosses just decide not to grope. But so we do have some strong disagreements with Walter on some of those subjects, but we do agree that podcast Patreon memberships should be voluntary. But if you like what we do and you want to support it, please do consider doing that. $5 a month. You get access to every single post game after every single episode of the show, Discord server. Occasionally we release things early to patrons. We might actually do that with the full video of the debate. I'm not sure. And most importantly, our undying love and gratitude for helping to keep the lights on. So on that note, we are going to go to the post game. Left is best.